The country of Myanmar has been plastered all over the news in the United States and the entire world recently, with the Southeast Asian country being unique among its neighbors, having a large 1,500-kilometer border with the region of South Asia, which is quite distinct indeed from the peoples and cultures of East and Southeast Asia. However, no borders are impermeable, and interactions and migrations have occurred through this porous border of mountains and valleys on both sides, with there being many groups of East and Southeast Asian descent in the northeast region of South Asia and parts of regions such as Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and the Seven Sister States of India. And seeing how Myanmar is the only Southeast Asian country with a land border with any South Asian country, and is most likely the country with the most recent and pervasive South Asian influence in all of Southeast Asia, the Rohingya people are one of the results of their proximity to the South Asian region, and have been highlighted as an example of one of the most heavily persecuted minorities in the world. But before we get into that, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the history of Burma and what led to this conflict in the first place. Myanmar, which was historically and up until very recently known as Burma, has around 52 million people, and as mentioned earlier, borders the countries of Bangladesh, India, China, and Thailand. The bulk of Myanmar's population belongs to various Sino-Tibetan tribes, meaning they're related to Tibetan peoples and distantly related to the Chinese as well, with the dominant group in the country being the Bamar at over 2/3 of the population. It's believed that the Bamar's ancestors migrated south from the Tibetan plateau around 800 AD and gradually assimilated the original inhabitants, who were most likely from various Thai and Austroasiatic ethnic groups. Despite speaking a Sino-Tibetan language, the majority of the gene pool of the Bamar is of Southeast Asian rather than East Asian descent, being similar in appearance to other Southeast Asian groups on the mainland of the region. The Bamar and most other ethnic groups in Myanmar are a devoutly religious population ascribing to the Theravada sect of Buddhism, similar to other Southeast Asians such as Thai, Lao, and Cambodians. Some of the other major ethnic groups in the country include the Shan, a people group related to the Thai people of Thailand and Laos, the Karen people in the mountainous border region near Thailand, the Mon people, who are actually an Austroasiatic group related to the Vietnamese in Khmer, and the Chin and Naga people on the border with India, who are actually majority Christian and also have a significant presence in neighboring northeast India as well. Now, the Burmese government recognizes all of these ethnic groups and over 100 others as the indigenous peoples of Myanmar, which grants them citizenship and free movement throughout the country. However, the Rohingya, who have actually been in the region for hundreds of years, are not recognized as a native group by the government, and because of this are denied citizenship and other human rights, which has resulted in chaos for their people. But why has the Burmese government felt and acted this way exactly? After all, the state of Myanmar does have many diverse people groups from many different regions and religions. The Rohingya people are an Indo-Aryan ethnic group, meaning that they're related to many other groups from South Asia, such as the Assamese, Hindi speakers, and especially the Bengalis, and their appearance certainly distinguishes them from other Southeast Asian groups, being far darker in appearance and having different facial features. The Rohingya are also predominantly practitioners of Sunni Islam, with Arab traders having arrived in the Bay of Bengal and spreading the religion around a millennia ago. They are largely confined to the state of Rakhine in Myanmar, which they share with the Rakhine or Rakhine people, mostly in the northern portion, especially on the border with Bangladesh. And according to the last Burmese census in 2014, they make up around 40% of the state. It's also important to note that there's a significant proportion of the Rakhine people, a fellow Sino-Tibetan people group, that are also Muslims, yet they don't face the same discriminations and hardships of the Rohingya, and it's also important to note that there is another Islamic Indo-Aryan ethnic group closely related to the Rohingyas, known as the Khmer, that have adopted the Rakhine language and are actually recognized by the Myanmar government as an indigenous group, and have full rights, although because of their association and proximity with the Rohingya, they have also been negatively affected by the military abuse. The seeds of the government's resentment largely begins with the British invasion and annexation of Upper Burma when the British captured Rangoon in 1824. Even though most Burmese were culturally, religiously, and racially distinct from the neighboring South Asians, they were incorporated into the British Raj along with modern India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, although the latter two didn't exist back then, of course, and the British would annex the remainder of Burma in 1885. About a century before the British invasion of Burma, the Burmese forces had invaded and occupied Rakhine, causing thousands of ethnic Arakkans and Rohingya to be executed or flee to neighboring Bangladesh, which left the region fairly depopulated for over 100 years when compared to its neighbors. During its incorporation as a province of the British Raj, the British authorities allowed free movement throughout the entirety of the territory and especially encouraged migration from the densely populated Bengal into the adjacent Rakhine, and almost all of these Bengali immigrants were Muslim, and they were assimilated into the Rohingya society. They also encouraged mass migration from virtually all of the British Raj, with hundreds of thousands of Indians arriving in Burma every year since the late 1800s, and these immigrants came from pretty much every part of India, including Assam, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Odisha, Punjab, Gujarat, and Bihar, and there was also a large Nepali community in northern Burma as well. By 1940, Indians made up over 15% of Burma's population and made up the majority in major cities like Rangoon and Masaman, and were effectively dominant in politics and the economy, being far better off than the native Burmese and Arakkans, and the British favored them more often than not, leading to feelings of resentment, jealousy, and bitterness between the South Asians and the natives of Myanmar. For this reason, the Burmese Indians were far more pro-British and loathed the prospect of Burmese independence, knowing they could not maintain the status quo of South Asian dominance alone. During the Japanese invasion of Myanmar in World War II, the South Asians were staunchly anti-Japanese, in contrast to many Burmese and Rakhine who welcomed the Japanese as liberators from the British, and conflicts between the Rakhine and Rohingya resulted in tens of thousands of casualties. Following eventual Burmese independence in 1948, the Burmese government began mass purges of anyone of South Asian descent from government, seizing Indian homes and businesses, and deporting large numbers of Indians en masse. Today, there are still fairly large communities of South Asians in Myanmar, although they're largely stateless persons, meaning they have no citizenship, as the government of Myanmar refuses to give them such a right, despite almost all being born in the country, or having their grandparents born in the country, or great-grandparents, or great-great-grandparents. The Burmese government carries the fear and resentment of mass Indian migration from the British colonial era and is taking no chances barring South Asians from holding public office, serving in the military, or even voting, and for this reason many have returned back home to the subcontinent, and only around 2 to 5% of Myanmar is of South Asian descent today, down from 16% in 1940. The Rohingya are a bit different, seeing how they actually do have ancestors that were in the region since before the British and their allowance of uncontrolled migration into Burma. The government, however, still sees them as illegal Bangladeshi immigrants and is eager to do away with them, much like the rest of the South Asian community in the country. One of the catalysts for violence in Rakhine State as of late has been a small group of extremists in the Rohingya community known as the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, who have conducted guerrilla warfare in an insurgency against the Burmese military, and the Burmese government fears that what's happening in the southern Philippines with the rise of Abu Sayyaf and other Islamist militant groups will happen in Rakhine State, despite the ARSA insurgents currently numbering a meager 500 at the most. Because of the military's intrusion into Rohingya villages and mass deportations, the Rohingya have one of the largest diasporas of any group, with there being around 1 million Rohingya in Myanmar, but over 1.4 million outside of the country, having 600,000 in Bangladesh, and possibly much more than this following the latest rounds of purges, 450,000 in Saudi Arabia, where they largely integrate with other Muslim South Asian communities, 250,000 in Pakistan, 150,000 in other parts of Southeast Asia, especially Thailand and Malaysia, 40,000 in India, and 20,000 in the United States, who are actually very recent immigrants arriving in August of 2017. Another fear of the Burmese government is the fact that Muslim birth rates are so much higher than the native population, especially considering that Myanmar has an extraordinarily low fertility rate for a Southeast Asian country, with the Rohingya having 50% more children on average than the Burmese or Arakkans, and Muslims would make up the majority of Rakhine and would probably spread throughout the country in a matter of decades if not for the purges. Now, obviously, the general Burmese public is not responsible for the violence and atrocities committed by the military and authoritarian government, and the fear is largely a combination of historical anti-South Asian and anti-Muslim sentiments, along with the rising threat of Islamic extremism and the ever-present fear that the jungles of Rakhine could become the next breeding ground for an insurgency, and this has resulted in an especially hostile environment for the Rohingya people. Keep in mind, this video isn't trying to point fingers at Burmese people who pretty much have little to no control over the government or military, but simply draw attention to and look at the history behind what can very clearly be described as an ethnic cleansing. Regardless of what you think of Islam or Muslims, innocent people do not deserve to be driven from their homes, sexually assaulted, and killed for what their ancestors have done, and fears that, in all honesty, are largely blown out of proportion. Rohingya refugees are in danger of being exploited, sold into human trafficking rings, and because of the bitterness and resentment of many Rohingya youth, they're a prime target for Islamist recruiters such as ISIS and the ARSA. I hope for nothing more than an end to the violence in Myanmar and wish for a swift solution to this conflict as soon as possible. Be sure to let me know your thoughts on the Rohingya and the crisis surrounding them, and as always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.